Hey guys, this is Mitch. Welcome back. So it's a new week. We're going to look at a new book, and we're going to do it in a new kind of way. I know I've kind of said that before, but this time it's true to the point where we're kind of throwing the format completely out the window. We're going to look at some Conan comics this week. And so just before we get into it, if you enjoy the channel, if you feel like you might want to support me a little bit as an artist, what you can do is in the description, there's links to my Patreon. And if you subscribe there, that gives you access to everything I do, from the Blood Force stuff to these YouTube videos before they get uploaded to YouTube, and some Patreon exclusives. Also, you can follow me on Instagram. So this was at the suggestion from somebody on one of the live streams. I wish I could remember which one it was. It was quite a while ago now, probably a couple of months thinking about it. So I apologize for not getting your name in here, but he suggested doing some Conan books, and I'm like, that sounds like a great idea. Because Conan has just a history of quality comics, particularly at Marvel. There is a difficulty, though, in Conan in that it's tough to determine which comics to use as a representative. Because I don't know if I'm going to come back to Conan at a later date. It's an idea. So I'd want to give an impression of at least a representation of a particular artist's work on the character. And that presents its own problems. Do you use Barry Windsor-Smith? Do you use John Buscema? You probably use one of those two, right? But even in that, okay, for example, let's take Barry Windsor-Smith, because that's going to be the subject of today's video. Which Barry Windsor-Smith comics do you take? Do you just do Red Nails? But then that ignores the beginning. And there's a very big change in between the beginning and Red Nails. And really, does the comic even fully represent Barry Windsor-Smith's work on the character? Because there's an argument to be made that his black and white stuff is superior. So that's largely what we'll be focusing on today. So let's start off with a little bit of backstory. I'm going to assume that everybody watching this knows who Conan is, and that he was created by Robert E. Howard, who wrote a bunch of novels and short stories based on the character that were pretty popular, mostly in the 30s. And then the property sort of languished, not being published for multiple decades. It seems like about 4. And then they started re-releasing paperbacks. And then around 69-70, Roy Thomas sort of approached the publisher for Marvel, Archie Goodwin, about acquiring a property to make a comic about. So he had a couple of different ideas. Conan was one of them, but he also had Tarzan, he had Doc Savage, the Tolkien books, John Carter, and then Thongor, which was sort of a mashup between Conan and John Carter itself. And that was actually the one they were going to go for at first, particularly because Stanley liked the name Thongor, by the sound of it. But they were afraid they wouldn't be able to get Thongor for the measly amount of money that Archie Goodwin was willing to put forth to acquire the property. So Roy Thomas decided to approach the estate of Robert E. Howard about possibly, I don't know, putting out some comics about Conan. And originally, he was supposed to offer $150 per issue as royalty. And he said $200 anyway, because he was pretty sure they couldn't get it for $150. And to his surprise, the estate of Robert E. Howard agreed. And now he had to actually, convince Archie Goodwin to pay out that $200 an issue. So they were going to go ahead with the series. Originally, Roy Thomas wanted John Buscema to draw it. And the only problem is that John Buscema made too much money as an artist, and they couldn't. Conan was a gamble because, it had some superhero-y elements. I mean, you can tell by the cover here. It's also a character who has no real, he doesn't have that foundation in the Marvel Universe. He doesn't have any sort of connection with the Marvel Universe, and he doesn't follow the usual moral code of the Marvel Universe. In fact, Conan is a fairly amoral character, for the most part. So Archie Goodwin and Stanley were willing to go ahead, but they weren't going to pony up John Buscema money. They were only going to pony up Barry Windsor-Smith money. And which might be a bit of a surprise, except that Barry Windsor-Smith was not a name at this point. He'd done some fill-in work. He'd done some issues of Avengers, I believe, but hadn't really established himself just yet. He was still pretty green. And didn't command a paycheck that could compete with John Buscema. So that's an interesting kind of confluence of events there. So let's get into this. So this is going to be Barry Windsor-Smith's treatise on why I should get more money. And we're going to start off with this cover, which is pretty convincing, I have to say. Now, you can see here, at this time, Barry Windsor-Smith has not established the BWS style just yet. In fact, at this time, he's not even Barry Windsor-Smith. He's just Barry Smith. So right now, he's still very much in his Jack Kirby clone stage, which is how he started out on the Avengers. But you see here on the cover, we've got a great heroic pose out of Conan here, dynamically lit. You got your faceless kind of bad guys in the background here. You got some Kirby crackle going on. And there is an element of Kirby to the face. And yeah, just to the general twist of the body. He's got that kind of dynamicism. Oh, and this, of course, is not going to be a copy of the original. This is the facsimile edition that came out a couple of years ago. If you want to get an original copy of #1 of Conan the Barbarian, you can. It'll probably run you about $1,000, though. So let's get into this and see what this is all about. And one of the nice things about the facsimile editions, of course, is that they reprint everything, including the ads from the period. So we've got our creative team here. Roy Thomas, the writer. Roy Thomas would stick with Conan for the first 115 issues. And he would come back intermittently as well. Barry Smith, not so much. He'd pencil most of the first 24 issues, but the leaps he made over those first 24 issues were gigantic. We're talking like J. Scott Campbell levels of improvement here. So, we start off with our opening splash page. The Coming of Conan. And a very sort of stiff version of a Jack Kirby pose here. I think the cover was done after the issue was completed, because it feels like he worked out a couple of kinks on the fly, because this is much more realized than this opening splash. But here, let's read the introductory scroll here. Come with us to the Hyborian Age. Come with us back to the dark centuries which sprawl between the sinking of Atlantis and the dawn of recorded time, to the days when the now forgotten land of Aquilonia was the mightiest of nations, and a man's life was worth no more than the strength of his sword arm. Come with us to the raw, untamed world of Conan the Barbarian. It's interesting seeing them having to sell Conan in a post-Conan world. So here we get our first real look at Conan, and what do we see? Basically, he's worked himself into a conflict between two warring tribes, as would often be the case. So Conan is hired on as a mercenary with a group called the Aesir versus the Vanir. And this is the kind of thing they would do fairly often, where they borrow from Norse mythology or something along those lines. Celtic, I feel like, would also be appropriate in this case. And we're going to get some shots of Conan coming to the leader of his band's aid. And again, you can see that Kirby influence, particularly in faces like this. He doesn't quite have the movement down. I feel like he understands the basic idea behind Kirby bombasticity, where you get your big panel, your anchor image, if you will, with your impact lines, although even those are a little bit confused. And the motion isn't quite right, but he's learning. So they're able to drive off this attacking force, and the attackers go and lick their wounds. And the leader and his second-in-command in particular tell the others that they're going to go and pray to the gods for victory. Basically just leaving them as a stopgap for when the Aesir come, as they're bound to finish them off. At least they'll provide them with a little bit of time to get away. So this is the world we're in, where there isn't an all-important quest, and our hero isn't particularly heroic, you know? He's basically he's in this for money, and the two sides, at least in this particular issue, are little more than warring tribes of bandits. So the Vanir leader finds a weird cave and stops in, and yeah, you see the weird choices he's making. He's kind of going for a semi-silhouetted look here, and doesn't entirely pull it off. And once they get inside, they find out that the cave is actually a temple. And the old man that they spotted here earlier is in command of what he calls a star stone, which glows in the darkness. And he's willing to help out Wolf, the leader of the Vanir, against the Aesir, all he wants in return is Conan. And at this point, Conan is an unheralded youth who doesn't really have much of a name. All he has is his prowess, which is impressive enough on its own. And with the Starstone, the mystic here is able to summon these winged demons, who were featured on the cover. And again, strange choices from a pretty green artist. You know, like this, most of the panel close-up of one of the Vanir bandits, but not really a shot that warrants a close-up. But you see some glimmers here and there of where he might go with this talk, because like this movement here is kind of nice. Olav is struck down dead by the demons, and one of them carries Conan off and drops him to be knocked unconscious upon impact. So while he is an adept warrior, he isn't invulnerable by any means. And I think that actually adds a little bit to the appeal of Conan, because he's not just an unstoppable freight train. He's mostly that. But he also has cunning, and he can be defeated. It's just that he usually won't be, because he's too good and too strong and too determined. And this is an interesting choice, eh? I feel like this was originally a single page, but they split it. I feel like these panels would have fit in here. Anyway, Conan wakes up in his cell, and he's woken by this girl, Tara, who was originally accompanying the mystic, but she seems to have taken a bit of a shine to Conan, to the point where she's willing to point out that the jail cell is actually put together with wooden bars. So she's actually sort of sabotaging her potential master's own goals. And while he has Conan trapped, the mystic is going to use the Starstone to gaze into the past of the world. So we get a little bit of history of the Hyborian Age, where we get Valusia, the mightiest mainland kingdom in the days before Atlantis sank. We get the outcast Atlantean King Kull, who I believe Marvel put out a book about as well. That also did quite well. We get Conan's birth on a battlefield in Cimmeria, and then him grown to a man, and then that man become a king. And then we go even further into the future, where man was hurled back into an age of stone and began anew his slow upward climb. So this was a world before Neanderthals, really. And then some spell or something kind of de-evolved everybody, and we had to re-evolve back into what we've become now. And then if he goes further on, past the Stone Age, he comes across Egypt, what he calls far-off Stygia, under another name in another time, and he goes even further and discovers Jack Kirby space comics, which break his brain, and I don't blame him. The Hyborian Age is not ready for Jack Kirby space comics. At that point, Conan breaks free, smashes the Starstone, which disintegrates the winged demons and destroys the temple, as well as Wolf, who I guess would be the last of the Vanir at this point, and the Mystic. And it turns out that Tara, the girl who released him, was actually Johnny Cash all along. No. Is actually one of the winged demons herself, and that the idea was that Conan would be traded. The Mystic took Tara from hell, essentially, with the understanding that he would supply a replacement soul. And that was what Conan was intended for, but he proved to be too much. And that's going to be sort of a theme for Conan. And we get a nice big brooding picture of Conan that's a little out of the ordinary for this time, it feels like, as he thinks about what he just went through. And didn't somebody mention that a kingdom might be involved someday? Oh, maybe. But he's already starting to forget it like a dream, pretty much. And he has more pressing concerns right now. Particularly, he has no food and he has no weapons, and he's far from home, and he's like 20 years old. So he just starts wandering back off into the desert. But we get the feeling that he can probably hold his own and find a new path. So that's Conan number 1. And we get even a map of the Hyborian Age of Conan. It's handy. So Cimmeria, way up in the north. And we've got here Asgard and Vanaheim. So he hasn't strayed too far from home just yet. Do they show Stygia on here? Yeah, way down here in the south. So that's kind of meant to be Egypt. Although, I mean, you know, there might have been some tectonic plate shift in between, right? All right. So, did Conan blow people away? Not really. The first issue sold well enough that they were willing to continue it. But as sales tend to do, they decreased from that point. You know, you lose more with issue 2, you lose more with issue 3. The real test is whether or not you can keep it past issue 6 or if you've reached an untenable number. And Stanley actually was going to cancel it, but Roy Thomas kind of convinced him otherwise. So they hung on for a little bit. Barry Windsor-Smith became exponentially better at what he was doing. And originally, Stanley wanted to put him on other projects. But at least for now, they kept him on Conan. So Conan continues. Barry Smith gets better with issue after issue, which I think gains a lot of steam around issue 14 and 15 when Elric first appears in the Marvel Universe. And Michael Moorcock is directly involved in that. And then shortly after that, we get Red Sonja. And right around there, we also get Red Nails. So this is a 1983 reprint of Savage Tales number 2 and 3. And this is in the days before they had trade paperbacks, before they were even a regular thing, before graphic novels themselves were even a regular thing. So the reprinting isn't necessarily the greatest at this time, but it should be good enough that we can see just how good Barry Windsor-Smith has gotten in a little under 2 years. I mean, starting out with the cover image, we could already see his figure work has improved. His use of the landscape has gotten remarkably better. Also, he's getting a lot more defined with the line work here. And it's interesting comparing this to that first issue from Conan number 1. Like, this is the same guy 2 years later. It doesn't look like it. It helps that the color scheme is about the same. But you can see the level of improvement is insane. And at this point, Barry Windsor-Smith is kind of like, I'm trying to find a parallel that isn't Rob Liefeld. There's a little bit of that. Obviously, his fundamentals are far better than Liefeld's were, in that he has some. But there is a comparison in Rob Liefeld started out as sort of a more updated version of his idols, which were like Art Adams and George Perez. And Barry Windsor-Smith kind of starts out just aping his idol in Jack Kirby. The difference, of course, being that Barry Windsor-Smith is Barry Windsor-Smith, and he just explodes from there and starts learning as much as he can and becoming as good of an artist as he can. Like, obviously, in terms of comparisons, there's better ones to be made, and probably ones that Barry would appreciate a bit more. Is just in terms of, like, the hot young superstar talent who comes from everybody wants to draw like him, and he makes a huge splash and he wears his influences on his sleeve. That's the first place my brain goes. And full disclosure, we're in reshoots now because I've already tried to do this, and I did it my usual way, which is go through the pages one by one. The thing is, this is a 60-page comic here that's in the middle of an already kind of long video. And I ended up with an hour and a half's worth of footage to get this whole thing together, which, I mean, I did whittle down to maybe it probably would have ended up being a little more than 45 minutes. Nobody needs that, so we're going to speed through this a little bit more. And I'll start with just a basic rundown of the story. How about we do that? So Red Nails was one of the original Robert E. Howard Conan short stories. This was one of his more successful ones. And the content of the story is basically Conan and female companion Valeria. They're lost out in the woods. They used to be pirate compatriots, and they stumble upon this walled-in city. And it turns out the city is occupied by warring factions of a single clan. And Conan and Valeria end up helping out one particular faction to oust the other one, but then they're betrayed by that faction, which ends up kind of collapsing in on itself, and they have to basically mop the floor with whoever's left. Which is, I feel like, how a couple of Robert E. Howard Conan stories go. It's not a bad way to go, really. I mean, there is a nice aspect where a Conan story kind of ends where it should, not where it would be necessarily the best ending. So we open this thing up. Remember, so this is from Savage Tales 2 and 3, which is about 2 or 3 years later than Conan number 1. And if you recall how Conan number 1 started, it's a little bit similar, actually, particularly with the color scheme. But we have made leaps and bounds in terms of style. Again, like 2 years worth. And this is how far he's come. All of a sudden, there's no stiffness to the motion. And he's learned a lot more about rendering. He's learned more about composition, too. Although that would come to be more of a Barry Windsor-Smith hallmark. And you can see here we're going into way more detail in every aspect. Not just rendering on the characters' faces, but also the backgrounds. He's setting up his shots a bit more carefully, where he's understanding how a drawing should be positioned so that it gives you the biggest impact. So for instance here, where Valeria stumbles upon a skeleton, that's very economically drawn actually. It's very efficient in terms of what's really a pretty tiny panel, but making sure that you focus on the right aspects. And Conan himself has changed quite a bit since the last time we saw him. If you want to compare there, again, the 2 years worth of difference. Fairly more realistic. I mean, it is still very stylized, but he understands hair a lot more. He understands the shadows, how they're supposed to be placed. And he's not just making lines because that's where you put those lines anymore. Now he understands why the lines are there. And he's making different kinds. These are like classic Barry Windsor-Smith marks, at least for the time. I don't think he does this quite as much anymore, or at least he does it differently now. And you see stuff like this with this dragon, as they call it, which is actually turns out to be a stegosaurus. But his rendering has gotten way, way better since the last time we saw. That's why it's always the case. Whenever you want to see a guy get rapid improvement, stick him on a book, make him churn out the pages. And he will figure shit out or he won't. So we've got a nice bit of cleverness here where they get trapped up on top of a mountain by the dragon. And there's nothing to eat up on top of the mountain except these apples. Conan, though, recognizes those as some of the worst poison in the world. And for a second, it seems like they're going to die up on that mountain. Except it occurs to him, okay, what if I grab a bunch of branches and I strap them together, I tie my sword to the end, and I cover the sword with juice from the apple and stab that dragon in the tongue. In a pretty great shot. Like, if you blow that up and you work the detail more, like, that could be a poster, straight up. And again, we do get some slightly awkward stuff going on. There's the bit here where Conan has grabbed Valeria and is running with her because she can't keep up. I mean, you know, no one can keep up with Conan. I think that's what we're supposed to grab from that. Tosses her to the side and turns around and takes a big old swipe at the dragon with a two-handed sword. And the movement isn't quite right. These are both fantastic pictures, but the relationship between them doesn't quite match up. And so he is still learning, and we'll see little bits of evidence of that as we go on. Again, though, that's a fucking fantastic shot. And you even get, I mean, this is 1973, and we're getting a little bit of gore in the comic here. I think that's only because this was a magazine format book. I don't think you would have found that in the comics necessarily. But it's pretty great to see. I mean, you need it in a Conan book, particularly this one, which Robert E. Howard, I think, characterized as his bloodiest, sexiest story yet. And this is a guy in the 30s saying this. So they stumble upon this city. There's no trace of anybody that they can see. There's no farms. There's no roads leading to and from the city. So it's like, you know, it used to be occupied. They do see some old irrigation that hasn't been used in years. But, yeah, no, it's like it's abandoned. And go inside. Turns out the entire city is carved out of jade. And again, fantastic shots. Any one of these could be a poster. Whenever he does a slightly larger shot, it's the equivalent of like a double page spread. Where you just want to sit there and look at everything. it might have a comparable amount of detail to a Liefeld double page spread. I will say that. That he doesn't usually have the time to do a larger panel, let alone a splash. This is an odd choice for one. But I think you need this extra curve of the balcony to really sell what's going on. Otherwise, it would be a little confusing. I don't know if that's the case or not. And we get our second awesome monster of the comic in the Burning Skull, who's a representative of one of the warring clans. These guys are from the other warring clan. Valyria is just watching this guy kind of get ready to die, and she's not going to stand for that, and she's pretty much Conan's equal in terms of skill. So she leaps down, kills the Burning Skull, which turns out to be just a guy in a suit, but the skull itself does actually retain mystical powers, where if you stare into the eye sockets, it'll mystify you. And we get some very cool representations of that here. It's like simple concepts, but it's very well executed. And I think that's an attention grabber. So, as I said, I'm not explaining everything as we go. When they were searching the place out, Valyria got sleepy. Conan went off to keep searching, and that was when she saw the attack going on. Now Conan's returning and just sees a bunch of bodies. He's like, man, I can't leave you alone for a second. So yeah, they all head off to this one guy's camp, and we get little bits here where there's some sort of trophy taking, because every time they kill a member of the opposite clan, this guy just celebrates. So, for instance, we got 5 dead members of the opposing clan, 5 crimson nails for the Black Pillar. The god of blood be praised. And we'll see eventually that the warring clan does have its own sort of trophy taking. We get bits where they're going back to their camp. They have to cut through side streets because they're afraid they're being followed. They end up in a dark tunnel when they hear something following them. Turns out it's this thing called the Crawler, which belongs to that other clan. And of course, the 2 smaller people head on ahead while Conan tries to fend it off with a swipe. And he's able to drive it back for a second, which gets them behind this door they can bar, and then they can keep going to the much sturdier door. So, now Conan and Valyria meet the king of this clan. He's a little suspicious at first, but once they explain that they killed the dragon out in the grove, and they've killed a bunch of the warring clan, including the Burning Skull, and they even fended off the Crawler, he's like, okay, you might be okay. And we get a little bit of origin of how this clan and this war came to be, which is that they used to be a slave race to this city when it was thriving. And they were able to rise up against their oppressors and basically slaughter all of the town members. And then there was some hard feelings over a woman. That happens sometimes. Which split the clan. The guy that originally started everything was in on the losing side, so they tortured him for days and then threw him in the catacombs to just rot. And the conflict has remained ever since. They don't breed. There's no children. There's no chance of continuing their line. They just wage war on each other now. I feel like there's a few Star Trek episodes that kind of go like that. So Conan agrees for both of them to go and search out the opposing tribe in the morning after they've had some rest, because they have had a rough day up till then. And while Valyria tries to sleep, one of the king's serving girls attempts to drug her, but she wakes up before she can really get going on the drugging, because again, she's as adept as Conan, and is able to, she's going to try and whip some information out of her, but she does get tricked, and the serving girl is able to get away, escapes into those catacombs that we heard about earlier. And then we get a scream from the foyer as the opposing tribe has broken in to their fortress. Turns out that they've heard about these strangers that have entered the town and killed a bunch of their guys and drove off their Crawler, and they figure, fuck, we're actually on the losing side now. We got to wager everything on an all-out assault. So we get some great depth here and detail with just bodies all over the floor. This is the kind of thing I think I would have a lot of difficulty drawing, like making it all look like they're on the same plane. I think these tiles help. I just don't know how to implement it myself. And again, gory as shit, at least for 1973. Conan ends up covered in the stuff. And Valyria too. So they're able to wipe out the attackers, which turns out to be pretty much everybody remaining in that opposing tribe. So because of that, they're the winners. There's maybe like 20 of them left, but you know, winning's winning. So now Conan is going to go over to the opposing side, accompanied by a couple of guides. Valyria is going to stay back where the king is going to impose his wicked way upon her. He does sneak up on her, just, you know, because we've made a big deal about her being super proficient. So when Conan and the guides make it to the other side, they find that the crawler is there, and it is dead, and it is like a dragon lizard kind of thing. And they also find that the opposing clan has taken its own trophies, which turns out to be the heads of the clan that Conan is backing. And one of the guides spots his brother, goes nuts, and starts attacking everybody, including the other guide. He takes a fatal blow when Conan tries to help him. The guide tries to stab Conan because the king ordered it. Because really, he's just after Valyria at this point. But he got a little too focused because his consort here, turns out she was the original consort that started the conflict between the two tribes, because she's a witch with the secret to eternal life. And she needs Valyria so that she can take her vitality and add it to her own. And we get our cool shot of Conan walking through the empty foyer, because he knows there's no opposition left, except for the members of that clan who betrayed him. And he's going to take it out of the king's hide, but it turns out that witch has trapped the king and put him in a torture chamber. And he's going to tell Conan where the sacrifice is being held if he lets him out. So they agree. And of course, he immediately sucker punches them. And they roll down the stairs, which actually ends up with the king dying. But it did get Conan to the sacrificial altar, which is all that matters. And Conan's about to go take her out. I love this. This is like the only dialogue for a while where Conan just yells out, "Slut!" But he gets trapped by like a bear trap. And he's stuck in place. And right when the witch is about to stab Valyria, that original member of the clan who got thrown in the catacombs resurfaces. They don't say why, although I wonder if it's because that slave girl ran down there. And this is like our third monster of the comic. And it's pretty great looking. So he returns from the catacombs with a magic wand, which basically shoots lasers at everybody, as long as there's metal that he can aim at. So if somebody's standing in front of some metal, basically he shoots, the laser goes towards the metal, but it hits the other person in between first. And he just starts laying waste to everybody he can see. The witch goes to free Conan because she doesn't have any kind of magic to deal with this shit. And Conan, who noticed the whole metal thing, I mean, first he gets a little too close to a candelabra here. A big old fireworks explosion. I don't know how effective that is, but I mean, I think this is Barry Windsor-Smith trying stuff out. And then we get this neat little square off where they just kind of keep shifting position. Where the clan member shifts to the side, Conan matches and just makes sure that he's not in front of anything metal. And at the same time moves in closer so that he can stab him. And eventually gets a little too close and walks in front of a door. Clan member's able to take a shot. Conan's able to throw the dagger at him, which of course kills him. It would have to. But this is some pretty cool stuff. And like different pacing. You'd expect a fight like this to be like rah, 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 big shots. Like, you know, I mean, if you're thinking of it in an image context, which I have difficulty not doing, like, yes, it would go on for 12 pages, but each page would be maybe 2 panels at most, right? And this fight actually does end up dragging out pretty long because of this. Like, this is only 4 pages right here. But there's a fair amount of action happens in it. And of course, the witch goes running for the magic wand, but she's totally focused on Conan at this point, and she figures Valeria is just a helpless damsel. That's her mistake, because Valeria sneaks up behind her with the sword, and so much for you having the secret of eternal life there. And that's where the Red Nails story ends. I think there would have been more explanation for the Red Nails thing in particular. In the story itself, I don't know, it feels like it kind of got glossed over in this. But it's got to be tough translating this into a different medium. And Conan and Valeria make their way out of the castle. They don't really want any of the jewels or jade because they figure, you know what, this shit's probably haunted now. And in the Conan world, they're probably right, actually. And then we get a nice poem by Robert E. Howard to finish up with, where Barry Windsor-Smith can just draw some cool shit with Conan hunting in the woods where he gets confronted by a wolf. And it's beautiful stuff. Like, you can see how he would go from here to, you know what, I'm just going to do some fucking prints. Like this kind of stuff. And just make it super cool. And sell those. And I don't have to deal with any of this comics horse shit. Alright, so that's Red Nails. The only thing about this particular copy of Red Nails I don't like is that I had to see it in color. The color isn't bad, like it's fine for a 70s comic. Well, I guess this would have been early 80s when this was released. But, you know, I mean, it's Barry Windsor-Smith. If you can, you want it, like if he's not coloring it himself, he's only doing the black and white line work. You want to see that black and white line work. And from what I understand, originally, when this was printed in Savage Tales, it was a black and white story. I didn't realize it when I picked this up, or I would have gotten those instead. There's also a reprint in Conan Saga number 9, which is also black and white. So I just kind of got stuck with the color copy. Oh well. But I do have a single copy of Conan Saga from the Barry Windsor-Smith era. And these Conan Sagas are wonderful stuff. Because you get all the line work with nothing muddying it up. This particular issue reprints issues 21, and I think 23 and 24. 22 ended up being a reprint of issue 1, actually. Probably, I mean, I don't know why at all, but my guess would be because Barry Windsor-Smith needed a little bit of extra time to draw those later issues. And you get to see everything, like how he's rendering the water here. This will be a little bit before Red Nails, so maybe a little bit rougher. But you see the kind of detail he's putting in, like on this compatriot's face here. Got his arm hacked off in a battle. You know, there's a lovely mix of light and dark in these. You know, when you get these contrast shots where Barry Windsor-Smith's going to use something like an open door frame to really highlight Conan. And you see when he does want to put in some detail, we get what turns out to be sort of a trademark of Barry Windsor-Smith, which is this weird kind of oblique hatching where like he'll hatch a little bit one way, then a little bit the other. I actually did a little bit of that in Blood Force number 2. I didn't think about Barry Windsor-Smith when I was doing it, but yeah, no, that's the same kind of thing. And it's all fantastic stuff. I mean, like, you know, you just get him drawing a cityscape for what turns out to be a pretty small panel, but it ends up being a pretty majestic shot. We've got Conan wandering through a hall of mirrors full of illusions, which he smashes just by instinct. That's fantastic. Like, this is the equivalent of a splash page in a Barry Windsor-Smith comic in the 70s. And it has the amount of detail and movement and impact that you would expect from a splash page, but just boiled down into like a third of a page. And makes his way deeper into the catacombs until he discovers the Black Hound. That's some classic 70s comics for you. And again, you just see the strides he's made. In like 20 months. It's wild stuff. Naturally, he survives the encounter, comes back to the ship, and vows his revenge on the officer who sent him down there. Great shots. Every shot is at least good, and then every once in a while you get something fantastic. And you get it's interesting to see the kind of stuff they were doing at the time. Like stuff, this one here is reprinting issue 23, I think, where Barry Smith just does layouts, and then you get a whole bunch of finishers like Dan Adkins, Val Mayerik, Sal Buscema, and P. Craig Russell. I wish I could tell who did what, particularly so I could determine which ones were inked by P. Craig Russell. Well, I guess penciled and inked. And it doesn't look, yeah, I mean, it looks pretty good, but it doesn't quite carry the same oomph as if Barry did the pencils. Which, I mean, you wouldn't really expect it to. But in some cases, breakdowns really do still convey the power. It doesn't seem to be the case as much with Barry Windsor-Smith. So I don't think his page layouts at this time are as impressive as his finishing skills. But he would get that pretty shortly. And we do get a single splash page here with basically a gigantic chameleon at the black stones here. And some very thick inking. This is some kind of unskilled work, to be honest. And again, not the best inking job. If I had to guess here, I would say this might be Sal. I've never been a huge fan of Sal's work. And this would have been very early on, where he's still learning the ropes. I think he does eventually get a pretty good sense of composition. And he does spend a lot of time inking his brother's stuff, which doesn't look too bad. Again, not as good as if they had a better inker working on it. We get a little bit of Red Sonja in this one. Right, because this is reprinting issue 24, which is where Red Sonja first makes her first appearance. Yeah. So, I mean, if you can pick up one of these Conan sagas, like if you're not familiar with them, I definitely recommend it. Because, I mean, it's black and white reprints. You can usually find them for pretty cheap. I think I got these for like $4 or $5 each. And you're going to see some just spectacular artwork. And like just good old-fashioned fucking fantasy stories that move along and have, like I said, have great art, but they also kind of, wrap you up in the narrative as well. So after Conan, like I said, Barry Windsor-Smith only stays on Conan for a couple of years. After that, he bounced around a little bit, doing a couple of fill-in issues on things like Khazar. Did like an Iron Man, Doctor Strange, did a few issues of Machine Man, and got out of comics pretty quick after that, decided that he didn't like the way that the industry worked, particularly the work for hire process. And I mean, granted, it's kind of a horrible system, but that's what we got. And you think if you're getting into it, you know that going in, right? But not if you're the kind of skilled Barry Windsor-Smith soon becomes. And so, yeah, he splits away from comics. And he starts more of an illustration bent, starts producing prints, and gets a few other artists to join him in like a commune loft. And we're talking Jeffrey Jones, Mike Kaluta, and Bernie Wrightson. And that's the studio. And they're able to get a book together themselves within a few years and sort of pursue artistic goals. And then he would pop back in and out of comics for, the rest of his career. He doesn't do very much for very long in comics because he doesn't enjoy how any of it works. If you're not familiar with his Conan work, you're probably familiar with what he would do maybe a decade later on Marvel Comics Presents with the Weapon X storyline, which is all written, drawn, penciled and inked, and colored, and partially lettered by Barry Windsor-Smith. That's something I might want to hit one day, actually, thinking about it. And of course, one of the things he provided during that time was covers to the first 9 issues of Conan's saga. And so this is his newer style at the time. Like I said, like 12 years later, he kept evolving during all those years. So that's sort of a maybe not so brief look at the career of Barry Windsor-Smith from a Conan point of view. Honestly, wasn't in it for that long, but everybody remembers it, and it was very influential at the time. There was a lot of guys who wanted to draw like Barry Windsor-Smith in like 1971-72, because it was a very different style to what anybody had seen before that point. Everybody up until then was trying to rip off Jack Kirby. And then, yeah, 70s, you get Barry Windsor-Smith, you get Neil Adams, and it's just, you get John Buscema. It's a whole new world. And speaking of John Buscema, we'll be talking about him tomorrow. So check that one out. I don't expect it to be quite as long because, like I said, we don't have that seminal work to focus on. But that's going to do it for this one. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you know when the next one's coming out. Go and subscribe on my Patreon. That'll give you access to all these videos before they come out, usually a week or so in advance, as well as all of the Blood Force stuff, the pages and the finished comics, and some Patreon exclusives. And then go follow me over on Instagram. And if you DM me there, commissions are open, including Conan. I'll draw Conan all day. I'm not sure exactly why, but I do have an affinity for Conan. But yeah, that's going to do it. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.